Diabetes Connections is brought to you by OneDrop, created for people with diabetes by people who have diabetes, and by Dexcom. Take control of your diabetes and live life to the fullest with Dexcom.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This week, what is it like to live with a pancreas transplant? And why would you need one?
It was like I had control over my diabetes, and then all of a sudden diabetes had control over me. And it felt like my power over just living a quality life was just dwindling. And I was searching for answers.
Brandon Mouw shares his story. What led to that pancreas transplant? And how is he doing now, a year and a half later? This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of Diabetes Connections. I am so glad to have you along. I'm your host, Stacey Sims, and we aim to educate and inspire by sharing stories of connection. My son was diagnosed with type 1 right before he turned 2. He is now 15, and we had his first in-person endo visit since January. We did have a virtual visit in March, which was great. It got us through. We made some changes, but boy, it was really great to see Dr. V. We've been lucky to have the same endocrinologist all this time, the one that we met in the hospital that day way back when in 2006. And my son and the doctor have a great relationship. So it was wonderful to be able to go in and see him. Of course, taking a lot of precautions as everybody's doing right now. And, I don't talk about specific numbers. If you're new to the show, I never share my son's A1Cs or real health information like that. That's personal and that's his own stuff. But it really was a great visit overall. Control IQ is working so well for Benny. I'm thrilled with it. I'll probably talk more about that as we talk to Tandem in the weeks to come. But, maybe if Benny would also bolus before he eats, or maybe listen to his mother when he's supposed to change his inset instead of another hour of video games. But, he's 15, so what are you going to do? He really is doing great overall, and I really am trying to back off. Yeah, I know. You can already tell how well I'm doing with that. I've wanted to talk about pancreas transplants for a long time, years and years ago. And I mentioned this in the interview coming up with Brandon. My kids had to be very little. This was when my daughter still did Girl Scouts. So she was probably 7 or 8, which means how old was Benny? 4 or 5. But the Girl Scout troop leader asked me why I hadn't listed Benny on the pancreas transplant list. Why I hadn't talked to the doctors to get him on there. Apparently her adult son had a kidney and pancreas transplant and was doing very well. So she thought this was the cure for everybody with type 1 diabetes. As you probably know as you listen, it really isn't, especially when you can live very well with type 1 diabetes. So I did a little bit of education. She wasn't really the type who wanted to hear it. I mean, you know what I'm talking about, right? And I did ask Brandon about that because a pancreas transplant is not something you do if you're having, let's say, a regular tough time with type 1, right? So he will share what happened. He will share why he really needed this. And we do talk a little bit about people who ask those kinds of questions. All right, but first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by OneDrop. And I spoke to the people at OneDrop. I was really impressed about how much they get diabetes. And it really does make sense because their CEO, Jeff, was diagnosed with type 1 as an adult. OneDrop is for people with diabetes by people with diabetes. The people at OneDrop work relentlessly to remove all barriers between you and the care you need. Get 24/7 coaching support in your app and unlimited supplies delivered. No prescriptions or insurance required. Their beautiful, sleek meter fits in perfectly with the rest of your life. They'll also send you test strips with a strip plan that actually makes sense for how much you actually check. OneDrop, diabetes care delivered. Learn more, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the OneDrop logo. My guest this week was diagnosed with type 1 at the age of 3 and lived well with it for a long time. But things changed for Brandon Mouw in his 20s after a kidney issue. His lows got so bad he could barely leave the house. And doctors told him if he wanted to live, he needed a pancreas transplant. I'll let Brandon tell the story. Brandon, thanks so much for coming on the show. I am so interested to hear your story. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, let me start by just asking you, how are you? How are you doing?
This is the best I've ever been in my entire life.
Wow.
I can attribute that to what I've been through, and that has brought me to being able to accept the way things are and just being happy with it.
What an amazing way to start. What a wonderful thing to hear right out of the gate. All right, so let's go back. You were diagnosed with type 1 when you were very young. I don't suppose at the age of 3 you would remember too much. Do you remember anything about your diagnosis?
I remember one very specific thing, and that was when they drew blood for the first time. They took me, my parents took me to a hospital, and they took me back, and it was 2 people, and they didn't tell me what was going on. This is what I recall. They didn't tell me what was going on or anything. And I was held down, and they drew blood. And that was like the most dramatic thing I've ever experienced by that time. So that's all I remember from it.
Wow. My son was not yet 2 when he was diagnosed, and the same thing happened, but he doesn't remember it. But my daughter does, because she was sitting outside the room, and she just remembers him screaming, and what are they doing to my brother? I mean, it's just so hard for little kids. But when you were growing up with diabetes, would you say you had a fairly typical childhood with type 1? I mean, we're going to get to what led to the transplant and all of that, but I'm really curious what it was like for you when you were younger.
Yeah. I would say I had the most normal, abnormal life you could. I grew up on a chicken ranch, and it was we were just a self-sustaining family that delivered eggs to stores and markets throughout Southern California. But the diabetes never stopped me. It never defined me. It was just, if I had a low blood sugar, we test it, we treat it, we move on. I never felt like I was a victim of it. I never felt like it held me back. I played sports. I was always well taken care of. I never looked at it as anything different than just who I was. It was just a part of me, and I just lived with it.
I am so tempted to take this interview and make a huge left turn and talk about growing up on a chicken ranch. I will stop myself, but I'm making a note. If we have time, we're coming back to that. I have questions. Did you know anybody else with type 1 growing up?
No. The first person I met was when I went to a diabetic camp in 3rd grade. And I was around like 50 other diabetics of all different ages that were young. It was like shocking to me. I was like, oh, you're doing shots. You were testing your blood. You're having a low blood sugar. Like it was like a very eye-opening to me, because I lived kind of out in the middle of nowhere and never saw any other diabetics.
Did you go to that camp after that year?
Yeah, I went 2 years in a row.
Well, fast forward a little bit. When did you start feeling like your type 1 diabetes was not okay? I'm trying to figure out how to phrase that, but, how do you get to a point where a transplant would even be considered? Do you remember when things started to change?
Really, throughout my life, I think I was just predisposed to hypoglycemia or low blood sugars, because I would have low blood sugars just kind of out of nowhere, and they would happen, and we would treat them, and we would move on like it was no big deal. However, I started having the hypoglycemia, low blood sugar issue, and it was constant every day. And I can attribute it to me having a kidney stone that essentially destroyed my kidney, and it led me to having 6 surgeries and then having the kidney removed because they could never get it back to functioning. And ever since I had the kidney issue, it was like my insulin and food wouldn't digest correctly, and the insulin couldn't deliver the energy correctly, and it always turned to hypoglycemia. That's the only thing in my life that happened when it changed, and so I attribute it to that.
How old were you when that happened?
I was 28.
I'm curious, did doctors say anything to you at that time? Did anybody really draw the line from this to that?
No, and that was very frustrating.
Yeah.
So I had gone from doctor to doctor saying, look, I have this kidney problem. My blood sugars are all out of whack. No matter what, I went from this well-controlled life and everything was great to me then suddenly it was like I had control over my diabetes, and then all of a sudden diabetes had control over me. And it felt like my power over just living a quality life was just dwindling. And I was searching for answers, and no doctors had ever connected the dots. It never really made sense until I made a bunch of appointments, and I went to a doctor, and she just walked in the room and she just laid it out. She's like, look, this is what happened. Your body went into shock. It didn't know how to handle it. You can't reset it. And why you're going to need the transplant or you're going to die. And so when that connection was made, it then made sense to everyone else when I explained it to them. They're like, yeah, that makes sense.
Oh, wow. Wow. What kind of doctor was she?
It was an endocrinologist.
Okay. And what were you doing at the time? What kind of work were you in? What was your life like?
So after the ranch was sold, I went to school, and then I went to more school, and I became a teacher, a high school social studies teacher. And then after a few years of doing that, I was bored. I liked the job, but it wasn't challenging enough for me because growing up on the farm, you're always busy. You're always fixing a problem. You always have something to do. And being a teacher, you have that. But there's like this aspect that it's always fleeting. You have these students for a short amount of time, and then it's going to change over and everything's going to change, and you kind of don't have control over anything. And I never really enjoyed that. So I was like, what else can I do? And I decided to apply to law school just out of nowhere.
Oh, wow.
Why? It was kind of one of those things like, why not? Let me throw a Hail Mary. If I can get in, I'm going to do it. Let me just try. And I got into law school, and I was in my last year of law school when all of this started happening.
Wow. Were you able to finish?
Yep. I finished with bags hanging out of my back to drain my kidney.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, it was a pretty interesting experience.
Oh, boy. Okay, so you see this endocrinologist. She says, look, you're a young guy. You've been healthy your whole life, but now things have changed to the point where you need a transplant. What do you do next?
So it was a huge relief to hear that because it was the first time anyone offered me anything of help. Before that, every doctor was like, try eating this. Let's try this insulin. Let's try this pump. Let's try this CGM. Let's do that. I got a diabetic alert dog. And while they all would tell me I was having low blood sugars, none of them would help prevent me from having low blood sugars to the point of me passing out, to the point of them going to unreadable or like mistake or EMTs having to show up. And so this was the first time I received something that was an answer to the problem that I was having. I was really relieved of, okay, now I have something to work on and go off of. My question was, well, how does that work?
Yeah, what do we do?
She just said, hey, I'm going to refer you to the local transplant hospital and you have to go from there. But she says it's very expensive and you're going to have to beg, borrow, and steal to get this done. But if you don't, I don't see you living past 2 years, if not sooner, because one low blood sugar will cause you death. And that was like really powerful for me to hear at that time because I was having so many lows a day. And so I called the transplant hospital and I submitted all my information. And then they denied me to even see me as a patient because I would be considered high risk with one kidney. And my hypoglycemia, and insurance doesn't cover a pancreas-only transplant because in the Affordable Care Act, just about every transplant is covered, which is considered medically necessary. And while a pancreas-only transplant is considered medically necessary, it's also considered an optional coverage. So as a insurance company, you're not going to cover something that is optional. That's when I found out that I would have to come up with the money to pay for the transplant up front.
I have a really dumb question. So I have heard about a pancreas and kidney transplant. Were you at all a candidate? Like, did you ever think, all right, if they're not going to cover this, maybe they'll cover if I go bigger? I mean, not that you'd want to.
Oh, absolutely. So doing research and talking and calling and doing everything I possibly could to get this figured out, knowing that I'm like a ticking time bomb at this point. My kidney doctor got me into Mayo Clinic, and I kept calling Mayo Clinic in Arizona because that's where I went to law school at the time. So I was there, and that's where all my doctors were. So I was continuing doctoring there. And he got me into Mayo Clinic for, what's it called? A consultation. And I had to pay up front for that consultation and all that kind of stuff. But they're the ones that informed me, okay, so here's the deal. With insurances, if you were to get any other organ, the pancreas, it comes like it's a tag along. If you qualify for any of these organs, you then get a pancreas if you're also a diabetic. So You hear a lot of kidney pancreas, liver pancreas. They've done heart, then pancreas. It can be any other organ plus or afterwards with the pancreas. That's how
It's
that
like,
works.
this is a terrible thing to say. You don't know me very well. I apologize for a sense of humor. It's like one of those Amazon add-ons. You can't buy it by itself. But
Yeah.
if you go for this, we'll throw it in. I mean, why is that? It's so strange.
I guess because they're already doing it and they see the other organ as the more important one, because diabetes can be controlled through diet and insulin. And the reason why we didn't wait for the kidney, because I only have one kidney, is that more than likely my one kidney, because I had the other one removed from the kidney stone complications, my one kidney would be fine for the rest of my life. So I wouldn't make it long enough to see if there would be any problem with my kidney.
Got it.
And so the direction from Mayo Clinic, a transplant hospital, one of the best in the country, said, you need the pancreas-only transplant to live. And we also need $250,000 up front in order to consider you a candidate.
Okay, before we get to raising the money and the procedure, how were you living at the time? I have a friend who was part of the islet cell transplant studies years ago because she could not live by herself, right? She couldn't drive. She couldn't even walk out of the house. She was having, as you're kind of explaining here, that same kind of completely unpredictable and dangerous hypoglycemia, where it's not, I mean, we think about with like my son, if he's playing sports, he's going to go low, or he might have a weird drop overnight. But I assumed that you couldn't really do anything on your own at that point if it was so severe.
Yeah, it got to a point where I couldn't go to work anymore. It was just horrible. I couldn't wake up. I think it's hard for people to understand really what like a low blood sugar does just in general, especially when it's perpetual. Like low blood sugar takes all of your energy away, meaning that the body burns every ounce of energy it has to fuel the body, and your brain starts shutting down. And so when you eat sugar or sugar water or you take glucagon, your body then is provided the sugar to start back up only if you can catch it in time. And so every time your brain shuts down, your body starts shutting down, much like a battery. You have to recharge it and it has to reset and repair itself. But your body's not meant to do that. So after so many times, you start losing the ability to recover. And so the low blood sugars would just be so perpetual that just even like going to doctor's appointments and having to work or making phone calls or to think about things became almost impossible because I had so many low blood sugars. A whole day would go by and I wouldn't even realize it. And so I ended up having to move in with somebody that would help me and that I could call and that would check on me and all of that kind of stuff. I stopped working and focused primarily on figuring out what was wrong and getting myself better because I didn't have any other option at the time.
Wow. So they tell you it's going to take $250,000.
Yep.
How do you do that? What did you do?
Well, that was a huge blow because I was like, well, now what? I don't have piles of cash sitting in my bank account. My family doesn't have money. Before all this transplant stuff happened, I was a very private person. You wouldn't know I was a diabetic unless I had told you. I wore my diabetic medical ID bracelet. No one ever asked what it was about. Even when I was found with my emergency personnel, they didn't even pay attention to it. And so I was pretty private about that kind of stuff. And then it came to this point where I needed to find the money. I didn't know how to get it, who to ask. I couldn't take out a loan. I had student loans. I wasn't working. And even if I sold everything I owned, I would barely have like 15,000. So it was like, what do you do? And I started asking and researching, and it's kind of unfortunate because you read all about these sad stories about how many people have tried to raise the money and then they passed away while trying to do it and all of that kind of stuff. And essentially my roommate who was helping keeping an eye on me and my mom both said at about the same time, look, let's just put your information out there and see what happens. And I was like, nope, I'm not doing that. I don't want people to feel bad for me. I don't want people to know what I'm going through. This is so embarrassing. I can't believe it's happening to me. This is not what I want to be known as in life. I am not a victim. And I kind of broke down and was like, I don't have any other option. And I did. And my roommate put together a GoFundMe. I wrote a letter that we sent out to friends and family that wouldn't know what was going on with me. And nothing really happened.
Wow.
No one called me to ask, what was going on, what was happening. I did get a phone call from a family member telling me off, like, how dare I do this? And,
Oh, no.
and like I was doing something wrong. And then randomly, I got a check in the mail, a completely anonymous check, which was enough to get everything started rolling with Mayo Clinic. And when I got that and we were able to post that online, all of a sudden it like opened the floodgates and got the ball rolling. And then people started to donate because they saw that what I was going through was real and it was legitimized by somebody who donated money. And that was pretty, it like broke every stereotype that I had about people and just not caring, and me putting myself out there and showing myself like being vulnerable and that weakness. It kind of took that away and just said, there are some good people out there. Not everybody is bad and out to get me.
Did you ever find out who that anonymous donor was?
No.
Wow. That's incredible. So you're in the system. I mean, we can't go through everything because I'm sure it was a long and complicated road. But how long was it from the time that you were able to say to the Mayo Clinic, okay, I'm in, to the point where they called you to say transplant day is now?
2 months.
Oh, that's not that long.
No. So the pancreas-only transplant has the shortest wait list of all transplants.
What happens? Is it like in the movies where they give you the call in the middle of the night, get to the hospital? How does it work?
Yeah. It is. So they tell you like, hey, it's going to be, so I raised the money. I have everything ready to go. People came through. Like, I am just shocked as all get out. It was like everything opposite happened the way I was supposed to, but it happened because I fought for everything. It wasn't like everyone was like, okay, now we're going to go on to step 2. It was like, no, me calling saying, okay, what is step 2?
So you had to push
there?
During those 2 months. You still had to push and make sure.
I had to push, yeah, and raising the money, and it took me the 3 months and all that kind of stuff to get everything done. It was me making sure that connection was always made and that the ball was always rolling. Because had I not done that, nothing would have happened, and that's okay. That's just the way it is. But yeah, so I get the call, and it was Christmas. Decembers are usually when I've always had my surgeries or bad things have happened with the family. So I'm just expecting to get through the holidays and hoping for the new year. I'm like, oh, the new year is going to be so great. I might get the call, and I get the call, and I have a whole chain of people who get the call. I don't answer the call and all that kind of stuff. And I said, hello. On the other line was a lady, and she says, are you ready to get a new pancreas?
It's like Oprah.
Yeah. And I was like, huh?
The way you said it, I'm sorry to laugh.
No, but that's exactly what she said.
Wow.
And I said, well, yeah. And so she says, we have an identical match, which meant that it was my blood type and my HLA type. And the HLA is when they take my blood sample and the blood sample from the donor, and they put it together under a microscope, and they see if the blood basically comes together and interacts or if it fights. And apparently everything was good. And then she mentioned that it's a brain dead, so it was somebody that they were going to take off life support. And so that kind of hit me too, that, hey, I am going to be given a second chance at life because someone had to die. And then that's pretty powerful in itself. And that's like the greatest gift you can receive. So she says, how soon can you be there? I said, when do you need me? And she said, just get here within 2 hours. So I got there, and it was about 9:00 at night. I walked into the emergency room. I said, my name's Brandon Mouw. They told me to tell you that they're ready for me. And the doors, the 2 big doors opened like, oh, and a lady was walking down the hall and called my name. And I went running, and she was like, start taking your clothes off. So as I'm walking down the hall, I'm taking my clothes off, and then they run every test they can. they're sticking things up my nose. And I mean, it's just like crazy. And they run every single test, and then all the surgeons, all of the medical, just everyone's coming in, asking questions, doing all these things. And here I'm thinking, well, is this actually going to happen? Is this actually going through? Because they told me that it would be a whirlwind, like it would be something completely unexpected, but 9 times out of 10, you're going to get called in more than once because you're going to show up, the organ's going to show up, and it's not going to be perfect. And so here I am, I'm going, okay, this is my trial run. This is, we're just testing it out. And then the surgeon came in, and this surgeon was the same surgeon that did my consultation. And that was like such a relief to know that she knew my story. She had met my diabetic alert dog. So the first thing she said when she walked in, because I had all people around me, was, "Where's your dog?" And I thought, oh, like that was like so like comforting to hear that. And I was like, I couldn't bring him. And she goes, "Well, I think this is going to be a good year for you. It's going to be a Christmas miracle."
Wow, that's incredible to think about. So this is the day after Christmas.
The day after Christmas.
Oh.
So they wheeled me back. This is just my assumption. Here's the way Mayo Clinic is pretty cool. So they have 6 transplant surgeons. Each surgeon can do every transplant. They're a specialist at that. And then they had a person there getting a transplant at the time. So I'm the day after Christmas, I'm assuming it was another person like me that got called in. And the anesthesiologist that I had just spoken to was in the other room doing something. And so I was sitting in the room waiting for him to come in to administer everything. And I was looking around and everyone was talking to me. And here was the surgeon and her 3 assistants. They were all over a silver stainless bowl working on the pancreas. And I was like, oh my gosh. And then on this big whiteboard, I could see all my information and all of my scans and my x-rays laid out. And it was just like incredible. It's like you're sitting there. It's like in slow motion. You can just see everything and the potential. And the anesthesiologist walked up and said, "All right, time for your new life." And when I woke up, I wasn't in pain because in all my kidney surgeries, I was always in pain. And I was like, "Was it successful?" And the lady was like, "Yeah." I was like, "How do you know?" She's like, "Well, you're not on insulin. Your blood sugar is 82.
Wow. That must have been an incredible feeling.
Yeah. I mean, it was the most crazy thing to have experienced. It was like the first time like I could start processing emotions because it was like, oh my gosh, is this the end of my problems? Like, do I not have to worry about this instant death from these low blood sugars? Like, what does the future look like? What is going to happen? And like, you get flooded with all these things. But it was the first time in 2 years I wasn't just having a constant low blood sugar, and it felt amazing.
So I feel really fortunate to be talking to you a year and a half later because you have had to figure out how to live this new life with, I assume, no insulin. But I also assume, and I've seen you're very open now, which must be a big change on social media, about taking medications, about the anti-rejection drugs, the regimen that you have to go through. So first question is, are you still off insulin?
Yes.
Wow. What is that like in and of itself? Because you were diagnosed again at 3 years old.
Yeah, I did not know a life without insulin. So even to this day, it's strange because I'm told to be fat and happy and eat because they want that pancreas to work. They want it to be producing insulin. But it's so foreign to me to like just eat a non-low carb diet. Like, for instance, I ate lunch not too long ago and I had chicken, asparagus, and strawberries. And I'm like, okay, what are the carbs? And I'm like, no, I don't even have to worry about that. Like, why am I still thinking of that? But I do have hypoglycemia still, which kicks in every once in a while. And the theory behind it is that because my body is not used to it and that my liver hasn't gained its ability to kind of control those lower blood sugars because the liver holds on to glucagon or glucogen, that it hasn't built itself up yet. So I do still have to test my blood and keep track of that because the hypos I get every once in a while.
How's your dog? Is your dog kind of confused now that he doesn't need to alert as much?
He's living his best life. So he's retired and he just has fun. He is so good at what he does and well trained. He comes up and as often as he can, he comes and smells me to see how my blood sugar is doing. And then you can just see him, like, he's just so happy that he doesn't have to alert me. And then he'll go and then he'll just walk around and just be happy. It's like he doesn't know what to do, because for 2 years he was with me by my side, my friend, my companion, the person that would save my life. And now he just gets to be a dog. And it's pretty cool. And I'm very happy that he's able to live that life.
What's his name?
Boone.
Oh, all right. So tell us what you do have to do. I assume that there's a lot of medication. Forgive me, I'm not that familiar, but you always hear that, oh, you don't really want a transplant because there's so much to do, right? There's so many medications to take. What is it really like?
Yeah, they tell you that. Oh, the medications are just terrible. It's so much better just to stay on insulin and all that kind of stuff. And now that I've had the 1.5 year experience with it, I can tell you that the side effects are pretty intense. It changes you. The side effects that I experience are like my entire GI system and stomach it's always a little bit upset, and it's just never settled because of some of the medication you have to take. And the medications that I take are anti-rejection, which means that they suppress my immune system so that my body won't fight against the transplanted organ. And I've had 2 bouts of rejection. And so every time they up the amount of medication that I'm taking, which then worsens the side effects. And they come with things like they eat away at your muscle, and you have to take a steroid. So you're always like this weird bloated and you can't sleep at night. And then you have to take one that damages your kidney if you don't keep track of it correctly. And it also causes like muscle tremors and hair loss and headaches and all of that kind of stuff. And so I agree, like the medication is quite a daunting task. However, after being a diabetic for 31 years and struggling through those low blood sugars, the trade-off is nothing. I would say the difference is between $100 bill, then the $100 bill is like low blood sugars and all of that kind of stuff, versus a penny. And so I would take the penny any day over the $100 bill with all the problems. I don't know if that's a good analogy, or if that makes sense.
It makes sense, but let me ask it this way, because what I'm trying to get at is when my son was diagnosed, several people said to me over a period of years, well, can't he just have a pancreas transplant? And my response was always, well, the doctors told us that for a healthy person with type 1, it really isn't worth it. And I guess that's kind of what I was asking, because your situation was not the ordinary experience. So I think we're all individuals. I really can't ask you to make this choice for anybody else. But what I was trying to get at in a weird way was sort of more when someone who doesn't have diabetes says to a parent like me, well, you should just get a pancreas transplant or put them on the list. I would imagine that's not a good trade-off for someone who doesn't have those chronic hypoglycemia incidents, who is living a good life with type 1.
Yes. And I think that perspective is correct, because when I was a well-controlled diabetic, it didn't impact my life.
Yeah.
Like minimally. The amount of doctor's appointments that I have to go to now, the amount of blood work, the amount of fear of rejection, all of that kind of stuff. This was a last chance effort at making things right as a diabetic. And so I think always having the option of the transplant is a good card to have to play later on if anything ever goes wrong. But if you can control your blood sugars and you are doing well with it, I think that the best way to handle it is to stay on insulin and just live your best life, because you're far more prevented from doing things with a transplant on the medications, because a common cold will kill me. If I catch COVID, it will kill me. That's because I don't have an immune system. Well, I have a much different life now. I am alive and I feel good. But just because I'm not taking insulin doesn't mean that I'm cured. The moment something stops working, I am back to the same exact spot that I was. And so that's not a cure. It's a pause in what I was going through.
What is this COVID situation like for you? As you said, you have to be so much more careful. Have you left your house since March?
At first, I didn't, because we didn't know what was going on. And so now that we kind of have a better idea of what goes on with it, what the symptoms look like, all that kind of stuff, I take my temperature every morning. I go and live the best life that I can. I wear my face mask. I am constantly using my disinfectant wipes and Lysol wipes and everything like that. And I balance that life of, do I live in a bubble or do I live life? And where's that balance of being safe with it all? And so I just try to do the best I can. I'm not like, if I go to the grocery store, I'm in and out as quick as possible. I don't interact. I don't touch anything except what I absolutely need to, and then wash everything, go home and do the best you can. I mean, I still have to live life. I cannot have gone through all that I've been through to simply live in a bubble. That doesn't make sense to me.
I saw a picture of you on Instagram with a surfboard. Do you surf?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Did you surf before?
Not nearly as much.
Really?
I love the ocean, but I prefer fishing. Well, I'm not able to fish as much as I would like. My brother lives very close to the ocean. I'm about 45-minute drive away. And so I go and I surf with him quite often.
You know, it's remarkable to talk to you because you have a very, I'm not sure how to say this. You really have a very open attitude to all of this in terms of sharing the story, and yet, you know, being frankly quite inspirational and yet incredibly grounded at the same time, because you seem very well aware of the risks. And, you know, I'm sure that all the doctors talk to you very frankly as well. And yet here you are, not staying home all the time. You're playing with your dog, you're surfing, I see your fitness regime on Instagram as well. How do you balance all of that? I mean, you're a very young person, and at the same time, you've been through more than many people go through in their life.
Yeah. So I made myself vulnerable, and that was like my worst fear in the world. I didn't care really about anything else. It was just that whole vulnerability thing. When people showed me that they cared about me when I was given an organ by somebody who passed away, that was my second chance at life. That was basically my validation of saying, hey, you need to enjoy life and stop caring so much about what other people think. And then a doctor told me when she saw me 2 months after my transplant, she walked in the room and started crying. And I was like, what is going on? And she was like, I was the doctor who saw you in your consultation. I was like, yeah, I remember. She goes, Brandon, I didn't think you'd make it to the transplant. But she goes, seeing you today is like the most motivating thing I've ever done. She goes, whatever you did, you need to share that with people, because people need the motivation who are going through things that they think that are impossible to overcome. And at first I was like, that's just dumb. But really, it's true, because I couldn't find any information about someone that was going through what I was going through online. It was like impossible. So I decided, I was like, okay, I'm going to put my stuff out there and just see what happens. And now I am happy and proud that I consider myself as a resource online for people who are going through something similar, that can find me and ask me questions, and that can see that I haven't let this stop me. I am not a victim of bad circumstances. Things happen to me, but I work through them. I break those boundaries down and I move forward. And just where I'm at in life right now, I feel like that's what's needed for me to put out there for people and for inspiration. And as long as I can do that, I'm going to keep doing it.
I have one last question. I've been dying to ask for 40 minutes. Tell me about the chicken ranch. How many chickens? What did you do? I mean, you're a little kid. You're running in. You're getting eggs. I know you're thinking that, Stacey, this is a very simple thing to do. I grew up near a city. I know nothing. What's it like?
So we had a small egg ranch, and as I grew older, it became bigger because population grew. Everything got bigger. So we had a chicken ranch. We had 3 chicken buildings. Each building held about 25,000 chickens.
Wow.
And you'd have to feed them twice a day, collect the eggs once a day, and then you would candle them on a machine that you would put them on. It would wash them, it would weigh them, and then it would package them. Then you'd box them, you'd load them in trucks and go deliver them to companies. And it's all about raising the chickens from the time they're hatched to the time they can lay eggs, and throughout that entire process. And so it was a very interesting thing to grow up in. It definitely taught me what responsibility meant from a very young age. And I cannot imagine having a different childhood, because when I hear about what people's childhoods were, I'm like, oh my gosh, that just sounds so boring to me. Because no, I really would. I would get up and I would go check on things. Or when I would get home, I would see that the lights weren't working correctly. So I'd go change the timer, and just going and delivering eggs with my dad, and just like all those memories of growing up on a farm. Like, it is what you think, it is what you imagine it. It's land with the animals and with all the machinery and just working. And all you're doing every day is making sure that those chickens are well taken care of, and the customers get their eggs and their product, and doing the best that you can. And it's a pretty amazing way to grow up.
Yeah. All right. Is there anything about chickens that would surprise us? I mean, I think we all think we know. Chicken's pretty simple. They're not really, well, I know a couple people have chickens as pets, which seems very weird. But is there anything, and this is the dumbest question, Brandon, I'm curious. If the answer's no, that's fine. I'll probably take it out.
I don't know, like, in what aspect. To me, the most docile chickens I have ever come in contact with are called Rhode Island Reds. They're brown chickens, and they lay brown eggs. And those were, if you go in the store, and you generally see white and brown eggs. Yeah. And so the brown eggs usually come from Rhode Island Red chickens. And then there's a lot of other types of chickens that lay different colored eggs that have, like, we're just used to chicken with like the light or dark meat. There are chickens that actually have like squid ink color skin. And if you were to cook them, their meat is dark and black, like squid ink. So they're a very interesting, very multifaceted animal, and they are an amazing animal. They seem so simple, but they are pretty amazing and smart of what they can do and what they can accomplish.
That's fascinating. All right, that's for another podcast altogether. We'll have you back on and we'll talk chickens more. That's great. Okay. I had to ask, sorry. I will, of course, link up all the ways to find you if listeners want to continue to follow your story. What happens next? Is there anything medically that has to fall in line for you? Is it just a 6-month or an annual checkup? What happens?
So with the pancreas-only transplant, it's pretty rare. They do less than 100 of them per year. Not every transplant hospital is good at them. They don't have a very good success rate. And so basically the pancreas-only is kept track of very carefully for the first 3 years. So right now I'm doing blood work every 2 to 3 weeks. My medication gets changed based on that blood work. They're looking for therapeutic levels, and they're looking for the enzymes in the pancreas and what they are. And that kind of tells them how well or how healthy the pancreas is. And so that's what they're constantly looking for. So I'm halfway through the 3-year point. And so for the next year and a half, I'm going to be continuing that. And then from there, it'll start going to probably every 3 months and every 6 months, and it'll be every year. But in between there will always be blood work done and someone keeping a close eye on it, just because it is a very delicate organ. And you get to think of it like this. It's very similar to transplanting a piece of Jell-O. So just imagine making that a success. So that's why they keep such a close eye on you.
Wow. Well, I could talk to you all day, obviously, but Brandon, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story. All the best to you. And I can't wait to see how this goes and continue to follow your story as you share it on Instagram and elsewhere. Thanks so much. Keep us posted.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me on, Stacey.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
I will link up more information about Brandon and how to find him on Instagram and elsewhere in the show notes. Just go to diabetes-connections.com. There have been a couple of other articles I found that might be helpful in terms of putting transplantation and type 1 in perspective. But it was so interesting to talk to him. And thank you, Brandon, for indulging me on my dumb chicken questions. But I couldn't let that go. Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dexcom. And when Benny was very little and in the bathtub or at the pool, right, especially this time of year in the summer, I always noticed his fingertips. He could hang on the side of the pool and you'd see those fingertips full of little pinprick holes. I mean, when he got wet, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? I mean, at this point, I don't see his hands close up anymore at 15. But when we went to the endocrinologist, our doctor always checks, right? He always looks, how are your fingers doing? And they are normal. I mean, it's hard to see that they even ever were pricked as much as they were because we've been using the Dexcom since he was 9 years old. I mean, that's 6 years. And with every new iteration, we have done fewer and fewer finger sticks. The Dexcom G6 eliminates finger sticks for calibration and diabetes treatment decisions. Just thinking about Those 10 finger sticks a day we used to do makes me so glad Dexcom has helped us come so far. It is an incredible tool. If your glucose alerts and readings from the G6 do not match symptoms or expectations, use a blood glucose meter to make diabetes treatment decisions. Learn more, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. If you're listening as this episode is released on July 13th, then you may be aware of the Friends for Life virtual conference going on this week. Friends for Life is that big family conference that happens every July in Orlando. Thousands of people come. I think 3,000 people are usually there. This year, of course, it is all online, and I'm taking part in that as well. So please follow along on social media. Really, the best place to start is on Facebook at Diabetes Connections, the group. If you're not on Facebook, I'm on Instagram as Stacey Sims as well, and on Twitter. And go to diabetes-connections.com to sign up for the email list. If you're not on social media at all, the email list at least will keep you in the know with our weekly newsletter. All of this to say, I do have a very fun, I think, segment at Friends for Life this year. It is a game show, and I'll be making that available as a podcast episode pretty soon, hopefully in the next week or two as well. But if you've ever thought about joining Friends for Life but didn't want to schlep to Orlando in July when it's 8,000 degrees, it's a great way to see what this conference is all about. And it's free. So check it out. I will put a link in the show notes as well. And if you're hearing this after the fact, a lot of the conference stuff will be available for replay. I'm assuming you do have to sign up to see it, though. So follow those links and check it out, even if you're listening after the fact. All right. Thank you, as always, to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here next week. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.